Hi guys. This is Mr. Evans. This is for the juniors for my AP class. I hope you all watched my video on the new AP test, quarantine edition. That will be on May 15th, and be taken online. And will be for a 45-minute exam. One thing I would like to clarify is that I don't. When I said I didn't know what it could literally be on anything, it can be on anything. But the topics are not good. The topic that are not going to be included are like the very early stuff. So like units 1 and 2, which is like pre like in the 1600s, 1700s, that sort of thing. It wouldn't be that. So the DBQ slash AP test 2020 won't be any of the really early things. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing your studying. I do apologize. I know you guys did some of that for the first review assignment, but of course that was before it came out what the new AP test was going to be. So the test won't include anything before 1754. So I guess the first possible topic would be the French Indian War, because that started in 1754. So instead of being the 7 Years' War, it was actually the 9 Years' War, the French Indian War. So I think that's the first possible topic that the AP test would cover. So something to keep in mind. All right, guys. So today we're going to talk about the civil rights movement. Now, the thing is that we've been talking about so many different topics, like over the course of these past few months. But one thing that's always going on in the United States, regardless of what we're talking about, is the fact that America basically had an apartheid system in the American South, where African Americans were treated as second-class citizens, and that had been the case since the end of Reconstruction. And it was really, really bad. Black people were segregated in everything, in every public place, including probably most noteworthy in schools. But every public place was separated by race in the South. And African Americans were not allowed to vote in the South because of a variety of methods that were used, particularly poll taxes, where you had to pay before you could vote, and literacy tests, where you had to take a very complicated test before you're even allowed to vote. So black people were, I don't even know if it's would be accurate to say second class citizens. Because like if you can vote, and white people can vote, and you have to be separated in all public places, I don't even know if you could really be considered a citizen at all. So we basically had an apartheid system in the United States. So finally, in the 1950s, we're beginning to deal. Well, you could actually argue, starting in the late 1940s, we're finally starting to deal with this horrible situation, even though it took a very long time to do so, and it met enormous resistance, particularly in the American South. Which kind of leads me to the next point, because the thing is, I don't want you guys to think that, yes, it was terrible in the South, but that doesn't mean it was really good in the North. In fact, black people were subjected to enormous discrimination in the North as well. Black people could vote in the North, but there was, you know, basically de facto segregation. When I say de facto, there's de facto and de jure. De jure means by law, such and such, is the case. But de facto means it might not be the law, but in fact, there is segregation. So there was de jure discrimination in the South, but it was de facto segregation in the North, where black people were basically relegated to certain neighborhoods, certain houses, buildings, jobs, in many ways. So discrimination against black people was an enormous problem in the United States, particularly during the Cold War years, when we're talking about how we're a country that's all about liberty and freedom, compared to the communists. But look how we're treating our own people here in the United States. Now, there were two events in the late 1940s that I always think signaled a change in people's attitudes regarding civil rights. In 1947, Major League Baseball was integrated. Jackie Robinson was the first black player in Major League Baseball. Black people have been playing for decades in the so-called Negro Leagues, but Jackie Robinson was the first black player on a major league team. He played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. What he faced during those years in the Brooklyn Dodgers was despicable, where people routinely shouted the N-word at him when he went to go play. People spit and jeered, and he always handled that with enormous dignity. Now, Branch Rickey, who was the manager of the Dodgers, he did something very, very brave by actually picking Jackie Robinson, and Jackie Robinson could not have been a better symbol for the first African American to play in Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball is one of the quintessential American institutions, and when it was integrated, it might not seem like a big deal, a baseball player, but it was a big deal that we had a black player on a Major League Baseball team. Then in 1948, which we talked about when we were in class, in 1948, President Truman integrated the military, desegregated the United States military. Remember, his embrace of civil rights is actually what led the Southerners to leave the party in 1948 and form their own party, the Dixiecrat States Rights Party, with Strom Thurmond. So I always find it interesting that two of the most conservative institutions in American life, Major League Sports and the United States military, were actually the first two major institutions to integrate. And those two acts did a really, really big, really good job in actually starting to convince a lot of people, or at least starting to get people to think about the issue of civil rights. For a lot of white people, the first time they ever met a black person was in the United States military when they were in the Army. Because remember, every guy of a certain age was in the Army because we had a peacetime draft in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Except for Korea, it wasn't a peacetime draft in that case. But the first time a lot of white people met a black person was in the military. And that does a lot in actually knocking down a lot of racial barriers and barriers of all kinds, right? Like when you actually meet someone of a different race, that often changes your attitude. So Major League Sports and the U.S. military, two conservative, arguably conservative institutions, were actually played a really big role in actually changing the whole discussion about race. President Truman in 1947 had appointed a commission on civil rights, and they made some recommendations which today seem obvious, but were not, unfortunately, in the 40s, where he said we have to end, the commission said we had to end segregation, we need an anti-lynching bill, we need a bill banning poll taxes, and Truman believed that all the commission's recommendations, they made 10 in all, should be adopted. But unfortunately, they were not. And by the late 1940s, early 1950s, the budding civil rights movement began switching gears and thinking that perhaps the best way that we can advance the cause of civil rights is actually using the courts. Because remember, judges are there for life, so they don't have to worry so much about popularity, unlike presidents and members of Congress. And also, more importantly, these discriminatory laws in the South were clearly in violation of the Constitution, particularly those amendments that had been passed during the Reconstruction years, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. Now, the chief civil rights organization, excuse me, in the country was the NAACP. And the chief lawyer for the NAACP was a man named Thurgood Marshall. Now, a lot of you guys might know Thurgood Marshall because he was the first black person to be served on the Supreme Court. And he was appointed to the Supreme Court in the late 1960s, largely because of the work he had done during the Civil Rights Movement. And Marshall decided to take on Jim Crow itself, particularly in the schools. Now, I think what Marshall was thinking is the fact that segregating children is just so morally reprehensible that would actually strike more of a chord with a lot of people than perhaps something else being segregated. Everything was segregated in the South. But the fact that it was schools, Marshall thought would really resonate with more white people. Now, the case that ultimately decided the issue of school segregation was, of course, the case of Brown versus Board of Education. I don't have my board today, but Brown versus Board of Education. Now, some of you guys probably most of you guys have heard of this decision. Now, the issue was whether having separate schools for black people was a violation, and black kids and white kids, separate schools, was a violation of the Constitution, was a violation of the 14th Amendment. Previously, the Supreme Court had argued in Plessy versus Ferguson, a decision that came in 1896, that separate but equal is constitutional. That as long as there's a separate facility for black kids or black people, then the 14th Amendment actually isn't being violated. But of course, you could argue, and you'd be correct, that just the fact you're being segregated at all means you're being treated unequally. Marshall, interestingly, if we had class, I would be showing you this, but Marshall interestingly used psychological studies of black children that actually showed that, they gave black kids a white doll and a black doll, and they asked them, which doll do you think is good, which is nice, which is smart, which one do you want to be friends with? And black kids almost always picked the white doll instead of the black doll. And Marshall used these psychological studies to make the point that what segregation does, it creates a sense of inferiority in the minds of black children. So it was interesting to take that tack, right, to use the psychological studies to make his case. Well, the Supreme Court ruled in the Brown versus Board of Education case, which interestingly regarded the school system of Topeka, Kansas, not a southern state, that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. They ruled 9-0. Unanimous decision. And the court said the desegregation of the schools must be carried out with, quote, all deliberate speed. Now, the South responded fiercely to this decision because just as Marshall kind of used the school system as a way to try to get more sympathy among a lot of Northern whites, Southern whites reacted more fiercely to it being schools because people, view their children, as sacred, and they reacted very fiercely to the idea that, their white kids would have to go to school with black children. So perhaps it got a stronger reaction in the North. It got a stronger reaction in the North and the South, but for different reasons, interestingly. Now, President Eisenhower did not provide very good leadership on the civil rights issue. Now, I certainly wouldn't say that Eisenhower was a racist, but Eisenhower was definitely, conservative by nature, and he was really resistant to using the law to advance social change. He had opposed integration of the military in 1948, even though by the time he became president, Eisenhower actually said there are no second-class citizens in this country, and we have to treat all soldiers, white and black, equally. So he had come around on that. But he was not supportive of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. He said, quote, I don't believe you ever change people's minds with laws or court decisions. We would have, I know if we were in class, we would have a whole debate about this now, but I don't agree with that. I think that can actually start the process of changing minds. But Eisenhower was not supportive, and he had actually called his appointment of Earl Warren, who's as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Earl Warren is a liberal lion, like liberal lawyers, and to this day, really revere Earl Warren because he's the one who was behind a lot of the decisions that, pro-civil rights, for the rights of criminal defendants and so on. So he's a liberal icon. He had been the governor of California when Eisenhower appointed the Supreme Court, and Eisenhower said that was his biggest mistake as president. So it gives you some idea about, where Eisenhower might have stood ideologically. Now, Southern resistance was fierce. The Ku Klux Klan reemerged. In light of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, white citizens councils emerged throughout the South. They were basically the Klan in ties. More respectable middle class people who were opposed to civil rights for blacks. And Southern legislatures, does it sound familiar? Just flat out said that we will not obey the Brown versus Board of Education decision. It is null and void. And some states actually just closed down their public schools instead of actually having to integrate them. Now, in 1956, 100 Southern senators and congressmen signed the Southern Manifesto. And the Southern Manifesto said that we will use all methods to resist desegregation of the schools and civil rights. I'm being sarcastic. I love this line from the Southern Manifesto. It said, "The courts are destroying 90 years of amicable relations between the races." So, yeah. Now, the first major showdown regarding segregation of the schools was in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. The Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas refused to integrate the schools. He said, "I will not obey the Brown versus Board of Education decision." So, and just refused to let black kids in. So President Eisenhower, even though he was, tepid about the Brown versus Board of Education decision, weak, he basically was faced with a challenge. Whatever he might feel about the court decision, it's the law of the land. So could he really allow a Southern governor, a governor of one state, to basically say that, this doesn't apply to my state? So Eisenhower decided that he was going to send federal troops down to Arkansas to mandate that Southern schools that this school, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, was integrated. And he also nationalized the National Guard, which is a power that the president has, the Arkansas National Guard. So basically, 9 black students were admitted into Central High School in Little Rock, but it was only because of President Eisenhower sending troops to mandate it. And there's this famous scene where there's this girl. She's a high school age girl, not much older than you guys. And she's sunglasses, and you probably have seen the picture. And she's walking into the school, and she has an angry crowd of white students screaming at her. In fact, when she walked into the school, she was soaking wet because she was dripping with spit. It was absolutely horrible. And then she was talked about later as an adult, the constant harassment she faced in this high school, from the white students. So it didn't end that day. But, this tells you a lot, right? The fact that it takes federal troops to actually make sure that Southern schools are integrated. So this is going to be a really big struggle. A lot of people have this misconception that, Brown versus Board of Education decision was reached in 1954, and then the schools were integrated. That's not true. It took a very long time. Southerners dragged this process out for years and years, and it wasn't until really the early 1970s that Southern schools were integrated. Not as a whole, it was spotty. Some places resisted less fiercely, but schools were not really integrated in the South until the 1970s. And you could make a solid case that schools still have a major problem with integration, right? Especially here in New York City, right? New York City, a study that was done a few years ago said New York City has the most segregated school system in the United States. Also, schools, well, it's not our school because we're because of the way because we're a specialized school, so it works differently. But most high schools are neighborhood schools, meaning the high school is in the neighborhood you live in. And because neighborhoods are often mostly white or mostly black, that creates a system where even though there's not really legal segregation anymore, schools are still segregated because of just neighborhood patterns. Which is why in the 1970s, a solution, and starting in the 60s, but really in the 70s, a system of busing was implemented where white students were bused into black schools, black students were bused into white schools. And that was enormously controversial. And it had a lot of opposition, even from people who weren't racist, who just felt that, my child should not be uprooted from the neighborhood school and bused clear across town for social engineering purposes. So this whole issue of school segregation was not resolved in 1954. It dragged on for decades, this debate, and in many ways you could argue we're actually still debating this issue. All right, guys, so I'll stop now. In our next video, we're going to talk about taking it to the streets. Martin Luther King and the budding civil rights movement deciding to take on segregation in the Montgomery bus system, but then taking the campaign throughout the South to end vestiges of discrimination against black people. Not even vestiges, they weren't vestiges at the time. To end discrimination against black people in the South once and for all. All right, So I will see you in the next video. Make sure you check you check the website, because I'll be posting your next review assignment there. All right, guys. Peace.